I remember the exact moment I realized something had cracked inside me. Not loudly, not violently, just a quiet internal snap. Like a thread finally giving way after years of strain. I was 27, sitting at the small breakfast bar in my parents' kitchen, cup of tea cooling, laptop open. My name on a digital confirmation screen. $1.8 million. I did not scream. I did not run circles around the house. I just sat there, frozen, breathing once, then twice. I had thought for years that if anything good ever happened to me, I would explode with joy. But no. I just stared at that screen like it was an accusation, like it was a dare. My name is Alicia Page. I am 27. I work customer support in a tiny cubicle at an internet service provider. Most days, I write tiny pep notes to myself on fluorescent sticky pads just to keep my mental center from drifting. I am not dramatic. I am not unstable. If anything, I am relentlessly polite. But on that day, seeing that number, I felt something like warm fear behind my ribs. Because I already knew what my brother would say. I already knew what my father would imply. I already knew the emotional vocabulary my mother would use. I already knew the shape of their entitlement. It was pre-written inside my chest. Before I continue, let me ask you this. If your family demanded your miracle for their ruin, would you say yes? Or would you finally say no? I had not told them yet. Nobody knew. The air in the kitchen was still. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a dog barked once. I remember thinking the day looked so normal, so casual, as if nothing extraordinary had just occurred. $1.8 million is not generational wealth, but it is enough to change a life. And in that moment, I believed maybe it would finally change mine. I just did not know yet that the change would come from the opposite angle. Not from gaining something, but from losing everything I thought was safe. I remember how the light from the window hit the edge of the table, warm, soft, golden, and how it looked kinder than what I was carrying inside me. I remember my shoulders, stiff with disbelief. I remember thinking that I needed maybe one day to myself to understand the enormity of it. But I would not get that day. Because here is the thing about families like mine. Something good arriving in your hands is interpreted as a threat to their imagined equilibrium. And I swear, the silence in that room felt like a ghost already whispering my future. My breath shook once. My fingers tingled, and I felt something detach inside me. Not numbness, not resignation, something else. Something patient. Something that would become the quiet spine behind every choice I would soon make. A choice that would not destroy me, but would protect me. Here at Revenge Bible, we explore real psychological stories of betrayal and justice. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss our next emotional reckoning. Before the lottery, before the confirmation screen, before that warm fear in my ribcage, there was just my life, ordinary, contained, unremarkable in the ways that hurt, quietly. I lived in a house where my worth was always measured against my brother's needs, even when those needs were self-inflicted, even when those needs were bottomless, even when those needs were destructive. Somehow, his emergencies were always more urgent than my achievements. His setbacks were always more deserving of sympathy than my progress. And like most children of families where one child is the chosen gravitational center, I learned to fold myself small just to keep the peace. I think the first real moment I understood the hierarchy happened when I was 12. I had earned top marks in a regional science fair. First place, a little gold badge, a small certificate with my full name printed in bold. I remember walking into the living room to show them. My father was on the couch watching TV. My mother was folding laundry. My brother was pacing because he had just lost $50 betting on a football match with friends. I still remember the exact line my father said that night. "Go put it in your drawer, Alicia. Your brother is upset. Don't rub it in." And my mother nodded, as if it made sense, as if my success was offensive because it arrived on the same day his failure did. I walked back to my room holding that certificate like it was contraband. And something in me learned right then. Good things were only acceptable if they happened to him. There was another moment, maybe small to an outsider, but huge to me. I was 19. My brother was 23. He had maxed out 2 credit cards. My parents sat at the dining table whispering about it. The tone was frantic, urgent, like a medical emergency. My father leaned back in his chair and said, "This is what happens when a young man is under pressure. We have to step in." My mother sighed, patted her chest, offered comfort like he was the one traumatized. Meanwhile, that same week, I had gotten an acceptance letter for a scholarship to a design course I wanted. When I showed it to them, they didn't even read it. My mother said, "That's nice, but we have bigger fires to put out right now." The scholarship expired unused, and I went to community college instead and chose a cheaper path. They never remembered that detail, but I do. I always will. My job now, customer support, was never a dream. It was a compromise, a practical adaptation to a household where dreams were indulgent luxuries reserved for my brother's recurring reinventions. He could have ambitions even when he never worked for them. I was expected to stay reasonable, manageable, predictable. He was allowed to be volatile. I was assigned the role of stability. And stability in dysfunctional families is often just code for sacrifice. I used to come home from work, exhausted, my headset still warm from the hours of troubleshooting other people's frustrations. 8 hours a day, saying things like, "I understand how inconvenient this must be," and "I'm here to help," even when I was running on 5 hours sleep and empty self-worth. But I still cooked. I still listened to my mother vent about how stress ages her, even though her stress was often self-chosen martyrdom. I still helped my brother fill out job applications he never sent. I still was the reliable one, the steady one, the boring one, the good one. Looking back now, it's hard to admit that part of me believed that if I was good enough, kind enough, responsible enough, someone would eventually see me. Someone would eventually appreciate me. Someone in that house would eventually choose me. I was wrong. Families like that do not reward reliability. They punish it. They exploit it. They build their structures on the people who hold still. One of my clearest memories from before the lottery isn't even dramatic. It's simple. I was sitting outside on the porch one evening, maybe 6 months before the win. My brother walked past me, talking loudly on the phone to a gambling buddy. My father was in the garage, sorting tools. My mother was in the kitchen, scrubbing a pot aggressively like she wanted metal to confess. And I remember thinking, if I disappeared tomorrow, nothing in this house would pause. Not for a second. Not for a breath. But if my brother vanished, they would collapse. He was the axis. I was the scaffolding. Invisible but load-bearing. The family ecosystem wasn't balanced. It was lopsided. His mistakes were treated like symptoms of unfair fate. His choices were labeled as burdens. Others were obligated to share. I saw this pattern for years. I internalized it. I lived inside it. So when I saw the $1.8 million on that screen, it wasn't just a windfall. It was a shift in gravitational power. For the first time, I had something that could not be minimized, something they could not dismiss, something they could not pretend away for the sake of their comfort. And that was the beginning of everything.
The day of the betrayal didn't arrive loudly. It didn't arrive like thunder. It arrived casually, like a neighbor stopping by to borrow sugar. That is the part that still unsettles me. Betrayal in my house wasn't a sudden break. It was a confirmation, a continuation, a repetition of a script they had rehearsed for decades. But this time the stakes were not $50 or a credit card debt or a borrowed car for a weekend. This time it was $1.8 million. My $1.8 million. I told them 3 days after the email arrived. I did not want to tell them. I wanted to keep it private, protective, mine. But part of me believed that maybe they would surprise me. Maybe they would be proud of me. Maybe I would finally have something that was too large to ignore, something so significant that even my parents would have to acknowledge my value. I wanted to believe that for just one moment. I wanted to give them that chance. Foolishly, I assumed that big news might create big reactions, but it merely intensified the old patterns instead. It was evening. The TV flickered. Dinner plates were still on the table. My mother was scrolling through her phone. My father was finishing a portion of rice. My brother was tapping the table rhythmically, impatiently. I inhaled slowly. My chest was tight. And I said it simply. I need to tell you something important. Something big has happened. My father paused. My mother glanced up. My brother smirked, as if my existence was always background noise. I took another breath, and I said the words. I won. I won the state lottery. 1.8 million. Silence. Not awe, not delight, not shock. Silence like the room had paused to decide how to turn this into an obligation. My mother spoke first. Well, thank God, she said. Her tone wasn't excitement, it was relief. Relief like a burden had lifted. Your brother has been under so much pressure lately. Now we can help him get out of this cycle. The word we was her first theft. The presumption was immediate. The money was already ours. Not mine, ours. My father nodded. He didn't even ask how I felt. He didn't ask what my plans were. He simply said, now is the time to show loyalty. Family must come first. Loyalty. That was the second theft. Loyalty in that house was always code for sacrifice. Loyalty was never mutual. My brother didn't even hesitate. He leaned forward and said, just give me half. I can turn it into more. You don't know how to handle that kind of money. His tone was irritated. irritated that I didn't immediately hand it over. He spoke like he was entitled to it, like he was inheriting something that was always destined to be his. He spoke like my miracle was his property. I remember my stomach tightening. I remember the metallic taste of disbelief in my mouth. I remember the strange calm that came over me. I said quietly, "No, I am not giving you money to gamble." He blinked. My father's face stiffened. My mother frowned in disbelief. They stared at me like I had broken a sacred vow. My mother's voice sharpened. "Don't be selfish, Alicia. He is your brother." I said nothing. My brother slammed his hand on the table. "I need it!" he snapped. "This is how opportunities work. You're only doing this because you got lucky. Don't pretend you earned this more than me." I felt the shock of those syllables. Not because the logic was absurd, but because in that house it made perfect sense. He genuinely believed luck belonged more to him than to me, even when it landed in my bank account. My father stood up. His voice dropped to that tone he used when he wanted compliance without argument. "If you refuse to help your own blood, you do not belong under this roof." That was the third theft, the threat. He didn't ask, he declared. He used living arrangement as leverage. He assumed my fear would open my hands. But I didn't flinch. I didn't cry. I simply stood still. I said again, "No." My mother hissed at me like I was the shame of the family. "You are ungrateful." My brother scoffed. "I should have been the one who won. You're just a placeholder. You don't even know what money means." I breathed slowly, and something in that moment crystallized. The hook was not just that they wanted my money. It was that they believed it never belonged to me in the first place. They believed my value only existed when I was transferring resources to them. They believed my purpose was to suffer quietly. They believed I owed them everything. They believed entitlement was inheritance. The betrayal wasn't their demand, it was their expectation. That was when the betrayal became final in my mind. Not because they asked, but because they assumed, because they threatened, because they tried to shame me into surrendering the one miracle my life had ever delivered, because they looked at me not as a person, but as a holding tank for someone else's addiction. And in that moment, I understood something profound. They were never going to love me enough to respect my boundaries. Their love was shaped entirely by extraction. And I realized the only way to stay whole was to stop offering anything they could take.
There's a particular type of betrayal that burns slow and silent first, and then explodes later when the pattern finally reveals its full shape. The discovery that broke me was not a single moment. It was a sequence, a breadcrumb trail, a layering of small observations that eventually formed an undeniable picture. It wasn't simply that my parents wanted my money. It was that they had already planned how to transfer it without me. The first sign appeared 2 nights after the argument. Everyone in the house pretended life was normal, but the air was electric, tense, loaded, fake. I kept to myself. I stayed in my room. I wore headphones. I moved like a guest, like someone temporarily lodging in a hotel she couldn't afford to leave yet. But parents underestimate silence. They think silence means surrender. The discovery began in a half-accidental way. Not because I went hunting for evidence, but because I passed the dining room to refill water, and my brother was already there, speaking in his manic, low, secretive gambling voice. "Yeah, she has 1.8. At least half of it is basically mine." His confidence hit me harder than the words, basically mine. My breath caught. He wasn't trying to convince someone. He was reporting a fact. He wasn't hoping. He was counting it. That was clue number one. But I didn't react. I didn't interrupt. I walked right past, feet silent, so that no one would know I had heard. Clue two arrived the next morning. I heard my mother in the hallway closet, the closet where she kept her personal binder of important papers, birth certificates, medical records, receipts, and historically, things she didn't want anyone else touching. She was rustling through folders. I heard her say, "Bank documents, we will need the account number when she opens it." Not if, when. I stood still, invisible behind my bedroom door. She wasn't discussing whether I would share. She was preparing the logistics of transfer. My stomach nodded, but again I stayed quiet. This is important to understand. I didn't discover that they wanted my money. That part was obvious. What I discovered was that they were already coordinating the plan without my consent. The word entitled suddenly felt too small. This was possession. They weren't requesting access. They were behaving like they already had it. Clue 3 came from the smallest detail, and yet it was the one that made everything click. It was a piece of mail, a white envelope, addressed not to me, but to my father. It arrived mid-afternoon. I recognized the name of the sender, a small local attorney's office 2 towns over, a family friend my dad used to play cards with. The handwriting was too quick, too confidential looking, like a personal hand delivery before posting. My father opened it immediately at the kitchen counter. No hesitation, no privacy. A brief shadow crossed his expression. Then he slipped the papers under the microwave, fast, like hiding a secret was muscle memory. Everybody has habits. My father always hid anything he didn't want questioned in 2 places: under the microwave and behind the cereal boxes. That's when I realized something. Whatever was in that envelope was the next step in the plan to take control of my winnings. And that was when the shock finally converted, quietly, privately, into heat. Not anger, but clarity. The discovery phase is not the dramatic moment in movies where someone hits the desk and jumps to action. The discovery phase is like a body slowly lowering into cold water. Your skin recognizes the temperature before your mind recognizes the threat. The next day, when my parents had both stepped outside to the backyard, I opened that drawer below the microwave. There were the papers. They weren't full legal forms, not completed ones, just an outline. But one phrase stood out like a knife blade: power of attorney transfer, preliminary draft. And below that, in my brother's handwriting, his full legal name. The plan was not to convince me. The plan was to make paperwork that would allow them to sign for me. They wanted legal authority to move the money before I could blink. The room spun, not because of shock, but because for the first time I understood that this was not impulsive greed. This was a coordinated extraction. They were treating me like a temporary obstacle, not a human being. My mother's binder was on the table too. Halfway open and tucked inside were photocopies of my ID. They had prepared in advance. They had already assembled identity documents. They had already initiated contact with someone willing to notarize or process the paperwork. Probably someone who owed my father or who assumed my father was just helping his daughter manage sudden wealth. This wasn't a family argument anymore. This was an operation. I put everything back exactly how I found it. I moved slowly, surgically, so there were no signs of disturbance, and I went to my room, and I shut the door, and I sat at the edge of my bed with my hands clasped together, not in fear, but in steady, cutting realization. Every single moment of family guilt I had ever experienced suddenly reframed itself. It wasn't guilt. It was programming. My entire childhood was a training simulation for this moment. They had been upgrading my brother's entitlement since childhood, feeding it, protecting it, normalizing it. He was always positioned as the one who just needs help. I was always positioned as the one who should help. They weren't reacting to the lottery. They were cashing in on a long-term psychological investment. They had been preparing for the moment they could finally harvest something from me. Even though I had spent my entire life scraping, surviving, and minimizing my needs. That's when I finally understood the betrayal in its purest form. They never believed I was a person who could have things. They believed I was a source from which things could be taken. And that was the moment, the exact moment when the story changed. That was the moment I realized, not only did I have to protect my money, I had to protect my identity. Because the thing they wanted most wasn't the cash, it was my access. Once they had that, I would be erased. That realization was not emotional. It was strategic. And from that moment forward, I was no longer reacting. I was planning.
I was planning. People think the plan begins with anger. It doesn't. It begins with quiet. When I discovered the power of attorney draft under the microwave, my hand didn't shake, my pulse didn't spike. Something inside me simply settled. I entered a mode I didn't know I had. A mode that remembered every moment they ever minimized me, ignored me, used me, dismissed me. A mode that learned how to protect myself by pretending not to notice. I decided immediately that my plan would not be confrontation. Confrontation would just feed them. Confrontation would alert them. My revenge needed to be invisible. So I created two versions of myself. The version they saw, quiet, afraid, defeated, compliant. The version they didn't see, calculating, gathering evidence, repositioning the battlefield. The first step in my plan was simple. I left the money untouched. No big deposits, no loud purchases, no new accounts that might show up in the mail. The less movement in my finances, the more they would assume I was still vulnerable, still unprepared, still easy to manipulate. I needed them overconfident. I needed them certain that I would fold. Step 2. Secure the only thing that mattered. Autonomy. I booked an appointment with a financial advisor, but not in my city. 2 cities over,
in a corporate office tower where nobody would recognize my parents' last name. I didn't tell the advisor about my family. I framed it as wanting professional separation and confidentiality due to sudden wealth. He told me something that changed the way I structured everything. He said, "People panic when they get money. The ones who survive financially are the ones who take 3 months to do nothing but plan." 3 months. I wrote that phrase down. 3 months of silence would look like surrender to my parents. Perfect. Step 3. Documentation. Not for the police, but for my future protection. I screenshotted my brother's phone call as he whispered numbers about my winnings to someone on speaker. I quietly recorded my mother as she stood in the hallway discussing access. I photographed the power of attorney draft. Each file was named using neutral file codes, things that would never draw attention. HB01, C Alpha, C53. Encrypted, backed up, 2 cloud drives, 1 flash drive I kept in my bag at all times. These were not weapons, they were insurance. Step 4. An ally. I picked someone they would never suspect. Mrs. Larkin. Our old neighbor. Widowed. Soft-voiced. The type of woman who baked muffins for church events. She had known my family for years, but she never liked how my parents spoke to me. She noticed the tone. She noticed the hierarchy. I didn't ask her to confront anyone. I asked her to do one thing. Can I use your address as my mailing address for the next few weeks? And she didn't even hesitate. Of course, Alicia. You do what you need to do. That gave me an off-site location for documents, statements, and official paperwork. Invisible to the house.
Step 5. Legal groundwork. Not a lawsuit. Something cleaner. Something parents never anticipate. I signed with a wealth management institution that specializes in structured trusts. I created a trust designed so that I was the sole beneficiary, I was the only signatory, and any third-party attempt to request access would be flagged. And more importantly, even if someone tried to file power of attorney after the fact, it wouldn't override the trust. My funds were now behind a legal firewall, and nobody knew. Not my mother, not my father, not my brother. The trap was not to punish them. The trap was to watch them walk forward into a plan that no longer had my money at the center. Step 6. Set the emotional bait. I acted tired. I acted small. I acted worn down. At family dinner, I said, "I just don't want to fight anymore. I'm overwhelmed. I need some time." My mother softened immediately. My father nodded like a general who believed he had outmaneuvered his enemy. My brother smirked like a child who had been promised a candy bar. They interpreted my quiet as defeat. They always had. All I did was use their old script against them. Step 7. Information leakage. I made sure they overheard one particular line during a fake phone call. "I'll open the account next Thursday." But next Thursday wasn't about opening anything. Next Thursday was my appointment for the trust completion signing.
The purpose of the fake date was twofold. One, to give them a timeline to latch onto. Two, to provide them a window to make their move. Because the cruelest part of all of this was simple. I needed them to try to steal from me. I needed them to make the first real, recognizable step. Not because I needed proof to punish them, but because I needed proof to walk away clean. When victims leave without documentation, they get painted as unstable. When victims leave with documentation, they get painted as independent. Narrative matters. The final step of the plan was the simplest. I mentally left the family before I physically left the house. I slept lightly. I packed slowly. Tiny pieces moved into my car, trunk first, seat later, bag after bag. Never enough to look suspicious, never enough to draw attention, but enough that when the final day came, I wouldn't need time to prepare. I learned something important during those quiet nights. Revenge is not an act of cruelty. Revenge is the moment you stop allowing other people to write your story. I wasn't planning to hurt them. I was planning to free myself. And if the only way to achieve that was to let them fall into the hole they dug, then so be it. Everything was ready. Everything was positioned. All I needed next was for them to make their move. If you're drawn to stories where calm turns to power, stay with us. Subscribe to Revenge Bible for more tales of justice served quietly. Because the next phase was the moment they reached for something that was no longer there.
The day they reached for the money was still clear in my head. Not because it was dramatic, but because everything moved with the deliberate slowness I had planned for. Revenge, in the way I wanted it, wasn't a shout. It was a sequence of quiet confirmations delivered on someone else's timetable. It began exactly as I expected. Small steps, tiny administrative motions that felt bureaucratic and therefore harmless. My father called the local bank branch, where he'd always done business, and asked what documents would be required to help me manage a sudden windfall. My mother called the notary I'd seen in the grocery store and asked if she could witness a quick signature for me. My brother called an acquaintance who owed my father favors and asked about someone who would handle transfers for a family member. Each call was normal to them, a family using family resources. Each call was a rope I had already measured. I watched them from the facade I'd built, tired, broken, defeated. I answered with small words. I made no accusations. I cooked dinner. I let them repeat the script they'd said for years. Guilt, obligation, responsibility. The more they pushed, the more confident they became. Confidence makes people careless. Carelessness leaves traces. The first trace arrived in the form of paperwork. They brought a preliminary power of attorney to the notary with my father's name and my brother's signature on a dotted line. A page of possibilities that would have been meaningful if filed correctly. They assumed speed would win. They assumed the bank and the notary would be helpful to family. They didn't know that in the last 3 months, I had moved the money into a trust structure protected by corporate trustees and compliance officers who treated anything familial as in red flag. I had given my financial advisor explicit instructions: no withdrawal, no external request, no paperwork handled without my verified signature, and a legal representative present.
I had left precise contingencies for any attempt at outside interference. When my father arrived at the bank with their hastily assembled papers, the teller did what my advisor hoped. She treated the request like any other questionable family claim. She asked for verification. She called my advisor. She explained that a trust held the funds and that no account in my name could be touched without the trust's compliance protocol. The teller was polite. She was procedural. The teller was immovable. My father's face went slack. He held up the power of attorney as if it were a talisman. The bank manager explained in neutral tones that a power of attorney could not trump a trust where legal ownership had been clearly established. He suggested they speak with their own attorney. My father left the bank confused and angry, clutching paperwork that no longer mattered. That was the first cut. Not a wound, but a closure. Their attempt to take operational control failed. They tried again. Smaller. Sneakier. My mother went to the notary and asked if a verbal affirmation could be witnessed, something to speed things up. The notary, who'd been primed by a brief call from my attorney, anonymous, careful, refused. She said she couldn't notarize without personal identification and without the principal, me, present. My brother tried to charm his way with an acquaintance at the courthouse, but the acquaintance, quietly aware of the legal risks, backed away. Each attempt they made exposed them. Rushed steps, half-truths, a reliance on old favors instead of legitimate authority. The legal world does not bend to habit. It bends to paperwork, to timestamps, to signatures and protocols. I had spent months building those barricades. They spent a week trying to beat them down. The most effective move, the one that felt like the payoff rather than the punishment, was what came next. I took the evidence I had quietly accumulated, the recorded conversations, the draft power of attorney with my brother's name, the photocopies tucked in the binder, and I walked to the one person whose judgment mattered in a small town, Mrs. Larkin. Not to gloat, not to humiliate, to document, and to have a witness detached from family dynamics. She sat in her kitchen and listened. I played the recordings. I showed her the papers. She placed her hand on mine and said, "That is theft under the language of love." She agreed on her own to be a witness to my decision to press the matter legally if necessary. Her signature, simple and neighborly, lent a domestic gravity to the situation. This was not a private squabble. This was a pattern of extraction noticed by someone outside the family. With documentation in hand and a lawyer already briefed days earlier, I confronted them not with shrieks, but with a meeting scheduled for the bank and the lawyer present. I did not need to shout. I did not need to hand over the recordings. I let the bank and the legal representatives do the work that required law rather than emotion. Under the cool lights of the conference room, their scramble became visible to a third party. Their justifications sounded thin. Their assumptions were no longer automatic. My brother's arguments that circumstance entitled him to my funds sounded small when enumerated in legal terms. My parents' threats, eviction, ostracizing were documented as coercion. The bank manager explained the trust structure. The lawyer explained the potential criminal implications of forging or coercing signatures. Everything that had been emotional blackmail became cold evidence. I could have pursued criminal charges. I chose not to escalate to that point. My purpose was not to ruin them, it was to preserve myself. The legal language used in that meeting served as a barricade. They could not legally touch the funds. They could not manipulate my identity. They could not erase me. Afterwards, the house changed. Not violently, but fundamentally. My parents retreated into a quiet that wasn't remorse. It was recalibration. My brother stopped asking for money. He sulked in a way that revealed his bruised entitlement, but not his brokenness. There were no dramatic expulsions, no triumphant declarations. There were instead small contractions, phone calls unanswered, invitations declined, dinners eaten alone. Revenge, I learned, isn't the moment someone falls. It's the moment you stop being their caveat. It's the moment they discover the thing they relied on is gone, and they have to rearrange their life without it. I watched them face the practical consequences of their choices, not from a place of spite, but from an odd, unmoving compassion. I had given them the chance to be better. They chose not to. My victory was not in their suffering. It was in my quiet accumulation of evidence, my creation of legal walls, and the slow, exact demonstration that I existed on my own terms. The money stayed where I put it. My life suddenly broadened, did not belong to them. And in that small, steady truth, I found a kind of peace that I hadn't known was possible. When I finally moved out, it wasn't cinematic. It wasn't loud. It wasn't triumphant. It was a quiet morning, light coming through the blinds, one small suitcase in my hand. I closed the door behind me and didn't look back. The silence was different this time. Not the silence of fear, not the silence of defeat. It was the silence of reclamation. I drove away without shaking. My heart was stable. My breathing was even. Revenge was never venom. Revenge was alignment. It wasn't about punishing them. It was about choosing myself. For most of my life, I had operated as someone who needed permission to exist. I used to think love meant sacrifice. I used to think loyalty meant unquestioned compliance. But the truth is simple. When someone teaches you to disappear so they can shine, the most powerful act of resistance is visibility. My revenge was the moment I refused to disappear. And in that decision, I found a strength I didn't know I had. The money is still protected, not spent as a trophy, not flaunted, but held safely as proof that I own my life. I live alone now. Small apartment, quiet neighborhood, plants on the windowsill. I wake to my own decisions, my own calendar, my own atmosphere, and I feel peace. Sometimes the memory of what happened flickers back, not as pain, but as data. I see now how betrayal can either break you or build you into someone who refuses to let brokenness be the final chapter. I'm not angry anymore. I'm aware. I'm composed. I'm grateful for the clarity. I don't wish them suffering. I just no longer offer myself as the resource they feed from. And that is enough. To anyone listening right now, maybe you've lived your whole life shrinking so someone else could feel big. Maybe you've been trained to believe your pain is less important. Maybe you've been told your worth is conditional. Here is what I learned. You don't have to destroy them to be free. You just have to stop giving them your access. Revenge doesn't have to be fire. Sometimes revenge is architecture. Sometimes revenge is documentation. Sometimes revenge is simply walking away with the part of yourself they can never reach again. And that quiet exit is where real power lives. My name is Alicia Page, and this was how I overcame betrayal. Because revenge wasn't wicked. It was power and my strength. This was another story from Revenge Bible, where we turn pain into purpose and betrayal into balance. Subscribe and join us for the next transformation.